This is PediaCast.
Welcome to PediaCast, a pediatric podcast for parents. And now, direct from the campus of Nationwide Children's, here is your host, Dr. Mike.
Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to PediaCast. It is a pediatric podcast for moms and dads. This is Dr. Mike, coming to you from the campus of Nationwide Children's Hospital. We're in Columbus, Ohio. It's episode 558. We're calling this one Down Syndrome Awareness Day. I want to welcome all of you to the program. Before we get into Down syndrome, I do have a public service announcement for everyone, and that is to please pay attention to weather warnings. A few days ago, I woke up around 5 in the morning, and my wife was yelling at me, "There's a tornado." Now, I wasn't too concerned because we get tornado warnings here and there, and nothing usually comes from them. You know, when I was a kid, if a tornado warning came out, it meant there was a tornado on the ground and possibly heading toward you. Please go to your basement immediately. But today, with our modern technology, you know, they can see a little rotation on the radar, and they may call a tornado warning, and then maybe there's one and maybe there's not. And, you know, we all get sort of warning fatigue sometimes. But in this case, there really was a tornado, and it hit a subdivision about a mile from us. Now, it was a little guy, just shy of being an EF2 tornado, but even the little ones pack a punch, and we know several people who live in that neighborhood. One was actually a nurse that's a colleague of my wife's in the pediatric office where she works. And their house was hit full on with quite a bit of damage. The garage and the roof separated from the house. It knocked over their chimney, broke windows. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, and things can be replaced. And I know it could have been much bigger. It could have hit our neighborhood. And, you know, we live in a suburb of a major city that is not in the traditional tornado alley. So, you know, really the moral of the story here is have something other than a screaming wife to wake you up. So set weather alerts on your phone, invest in a weather radio, and even if you have experienced many false alarms in the past, please take the weather warnings seriously because they just might save your life. It was pretty scary. And I mean, I just jumped straight up in bed. I'm like, huh, what? And sure enough, there was a tornado heading right toward us. All right, so today we are talking about Down syndrome. Every year on March 21st, it is World Down Syndrome Day. And the theme of the day this year is ending the stereotypes. And so we're going to focus on the many misconceptions that surround Down syndrome and sort of set the record straight with answers to the most common questions that people have about Down syndrome. To help us do that, we have some terrific guests joining us, like we usually do. Dr. Mark Wells is a primary care pediatrician and works with patients and families in the Down Syndrome Clinic at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Dr. Murugu Manickam is a genetics and genomic medicine physician at Nationwide Children's. And Kari Jones is president and CEO of Elevated and works very closely with the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio. All of them will be coming along shortly. First, though, I do want to remind you, you can find our podcast wherever podcasts are found. Please do subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And we also really appreciate reviews wherever you listen to podcasts so that others who come along looking for evidence-based child health and parenting information will know what to expect. Of course, we're on all the social media platforms. We love connecting with you there. Just search for PediaCast. And we have that handy contact link over at PediaCast.org if you would like to suggest a future topic for the program. Also want to remind you the information presented in every episode of the podcast is for general educational purposes only. We do not diagnose medical conditions or formulate treatment plans for specific individuals. If you have a concern about your child's health, be sure to call your healthcare provider. Also, your use of this audio program is subject to the PediaCast Terms of Use Agreement, which you can find at PediaCast.org. So let's take a quick break. We'll get our expert guests settled into the studio, and then we will be back to explore the genetic condition known as Down syndrome. It's coming up right after this. Dr. Mark Wells is a pediatrician with the Lincoln Village Primary Care Center, and he sees children and families in the Down Syndrome Clinic at Nationwide Children's Hospital. And he's an assistant professor of pediatrics at The Ohio State University College of Medicine. Dr. Murugu Manickam is a clinical geneticist at Nationwide Children's and a professor of pediatrics at Ohio State. And Kari Jones is president and CEO of Elevated, which supports the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio. Each has a passion for supporting those impacted by Down syndrome, including kids, teenagers, adults, families, and siblings. They're here to talk about Down syndrome with an emphasis on raising awareness and correcting misconceptions regarding this common genetic condition. But before we get into that, let's give a warm PediaCast welcome to our guests, Dr. Mark Wells, Dr. Murugu Manickam, and Kari Jones. Thank you all for being here today.
So glad to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're really excited to talk with you today about Down syndrome. And today, really, the focus is going to be on awareness and setting the record straight on common misconceptions. For much more information about Down syndrome itself, and we'll mention some of these, but for really a deep dive into the signs and features, management, complications, things that, more of the condition itself. We do have another podcast for you, PediaCast 453, which we did just a couple years ago, supporting kids and adults with Down syndrome. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes so folks can find it if you're interested in learning more. But, as we start here, I think a good place to do that really is with a reminder. Mark, what exactly is Down syndrome?
All right. So Down syndrome is a condition in which someone has an extra copy of the 21st chromosome. And you may ask, what are chromosomes? Chromosomes are kind of like bundles of genes that help determine how someone's body forms and develops with time. This extra copy leads to 3 rather than 2 copies of the 21st chromosome, which is why we use the term trisomy 21 or 3 then somy chromosomes for someone with Down syndrome. Down syndrome can be associated with intellectual and developmental differences as well as various medical concerns. But our focus today is, instead of highlighting those differences, is on addressing and ending stereotypes of people who have Down syndrome.
Great. And then what is it then that accounts for the differences that we see in terms of the exact symptoms and the severity of symptoms?
So a small percentage will have mosaicism. That's where some cells will have 2 copies of the 21st chromosome, and some cells will have 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. It's just probably a little bit of a different mechanism by which it happens, but it does sometimes influence how much the child or adult is affected by having that extra copy.
Yeah. And does it matter which parent the extra comes from at all? And does it happen with maternal versus the fathers?
Yeah, so mostly it doesn't matter in terms of how the child's affected, but in most cases we do think it probably comes from the maternal copy. There is an association with moms who have advanced maternal age. So that was a relative term for being over the age of 35. And certainly your risk goes up slightly after you turn 35, but it's really not substantially different. And the truth is, in a majority of cases of families that have a child with Down syndrome, they were actually under the age of 35.
Yeah. And then it kind of makes sense then why it's called trisomy 21, because there's 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. There's only supposed to be 2. But Down syndrome, Mark, how did we come out with that name?
So trisomy 21 is called Down syndrome after the 19th century English physician, Dr. John Langdon Down. He had published first description of a person who had Down syndrome in 1866, which led to his name being associated with the syndrome. However, it wasn't until the 1950s that people discovered the genetic cause for Down syndrome as trisomy 21. So once this connection was made, we then had trisomy 21 called Down syndrome.
So Dr. Down just saw a common expression of a condition and didn't really know exactly what caused that because we didn't have an understanding of genetics yet, and it's named after him. Very interesting. I love those little medical historical factoids. So Murugu, how common then is Down syndrome and who is affected? Are there particular risk factors?
So the best current data we have is about 1 in 700 live births will have a child with Down syndrome. And it is kind of important to put into the context of live births because we do also know that there are a lot of miscarriages that can also have a Down syndrome karyotype if you were to look. those numbers have varied a little bit from year to year, but not really substantially over time. But I will also say that there's some concern we don't have really great exact information about those numbers. It does vary definitely by state to state and country to country, but it does affect all populations equally. There is no huge risk factor for having a child with Down syndrome, with the exception of a rare case where you can have that 21st chromosome attached to another chromosome, in which case then there's a slightly increased risk or to have another child with Down syndrome. But that occurs only in about 2 to 3% of cases.
So the majority of cases really just arise spontaneously. It just happens, and we maybe don't exactly understand why that extra chromosome gets copied over.
Yeah, I think sometimes the geneticist, I'm always amazed any of us are walking around. But one of the reasons I think with Down syndrome specifically is that actually the 21st chromosome is the smallest of all the chromosomes. So for example, if you were to have an extra copy of the first chromosome, which is the largest, that actually will end up in a miscarriage. There's so much extra genetic material that the body doesn't tolerate it. But because the 21st chromosome is small, the body tolerates it a little bit better than it would for other ones.
Yeah. Now, I'm not a geneticist, so bear with me. The mosaicism that you're talking about, so some cells in the body have a third one and others do not have a third one, have basically normal number. And so depending on which cells are affected and which ones aren't, that kind of determines the exact set of symptoms of characteristics, maybe I should say, not symptoms, that show up with this genetic condition. And so that's something that must happen not with the very first division, but it must be down the road that happens in order to also have some normal cells. Is that correct?
Somewhat. I would say that
maybe
taking the second part first, that you can have definitely, that's probably the most likely scenario, but there's actually also another scenario where you get something called trisomy rescue, that when the cells are dividing, you are born with all the extra 21st there, but because it's not a natural part of the cells dividing, sometimes that extra one's actually lost. And so we actually see this as people age in adults with Down syndrome, that as they get older, they actually tend to lose that 21st chromosome, especially in cell lines that turn over really fast. So if you look at like blood cells, you'll see sometimes in older individuals with Down syndrome that they've actually lost that 21st chromosome. But where you're also looking really matters. So we can check the blood, and that's how we most often make the diagnosis. But really what you probably care about is how is it affecting them in terms of intellectual disabilities and things like that. And we don't do brain biopsies. We don't look at the brain, but that will certainly reflect how much they're affected.
So then do you see any change in expression or like the phenotype as you lose that extra one as you age?
That's a great question.
Or no?
Because even actually in the regular case of having that extra 21st chromosome, it's actually not just that 21st chromosome. There's some really good studies out there now that we have to stop thinking of chromosomes very linearly and in like single lines. They exist in this big clump in the nucleus. And so that extra 21st chromosome actually affects all the other chromosomes. It affects the expression across all the genome, and therefore it's making little changes here and there that we really have a hard time picking out because all of us have that extra expression anyway. And so I think we're starting to kind of realize that we have to stop thinking in 2 dimensions and start thinking more in 3 and even 4 dimensions, because how our cells are expressed when we're infants is very different from how they're going to be expressed when we're 5, 15, 65 years old.
Yeah, boy, fascinating. And when you first went into genetics, I feel like you're probably about my age. And has it just blown your mind where we've come compared to where we were when you trained?
Absolutely. It's just, I was just at a genetics conference, and I come back from those conferences now and I feel like my mind's about ready to explode with all the new information I've gotten. And I thought, I understand things pretty well, but nope, that's not the case.
Yeah. No, it's so complicated. And really, we need today's computers often to really be able, to figure out what someone's genome looks like. And as we learn all of the twists and turns and clumping and other molecules that affect gene expression and all of those things. It's so complicated. So let's turn our attention back to World Down Syndrome Day. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Kari.
If I can just add one thing from the kind of zoomed out, like 10th grade biology approach here, maybe even more zoomed out than that. I think an important thing for people to just generally know, there are some misconceptions that still exist, that it's the mother's fault. Because I think that piece of it being tied to the mother and the maternal age tends to elicit a guilt among mothers, maybe more so than fathers. And so I think it's just important to reiterate that it is just something that happens, and it is not anything that a mother or father has done. And so we do still hear from new parents that maybe they knew that, but then their Aunt Sally didn't know that. And, other extended relatives are treating them a certain way because they're just really, they just have no idea that it is just kind of a thing that happens.
Yeah. That there's nothing that the mom did to make that happen.
Yeah.
Like drinking alcohol or drugs or
Right.
being exposed to something. This truly is just something that happens, and
Well,
there's
I
nothing
think
we can do.
anytime there's an abnormality, that's kind of where you go, right? So you're with anything, any either genetic condition or not. And so I think that's just really important to dispel with all of this, is that is, beyond all of the beautiful details of genetics and what can happen and the expression and all of that. Just when you look at the epidemiology for the lay person, it's just important to know that it just happens, and it is not something that the parents have done or not done.
Yeah. Really, really excellent point. Let's turn our attention to World Down Syndrome Day, and that is actually happening here in a couple of days. It is March 21st every year. And Kari, tell us about World Down Syndrome Day and the theme of the day this year.
Well, we love World Down Syndrome Day. We love playing on 321, 321, 3 copies of the 21st chromosome is how we get to that day. It's the 3rd month, the 21st day. This year, the theme is End the Stereotypes, which we love. Across the world, we're celebrating the unique and beautiful gifts that people with Down syndrome have. And I think that ending the stereotypes is an important approach to that, which is really stop thinking about what people can't do and start thinking about what they can do.
Yeah, I love that. And Murugu, what are some of those stereotypes that you find are associated with Down syndrome, especially when you talk with families and folks who are impacted by this? I'm sure they come in with some experience of having heard of it, but maybe don't quite understand it and likely do have lots of misconceptions.
Yeah, I almost talk about it a little bit like almost generationally. In the 1970s, a lot of families would have been told, don't even take your child home, institutionalize them, to some degree, just ignore them. And few families, started to not do that. And it became more acceptable that it's okay to have a child with Down syndrome at home. And then I kind of give the example in the 1980s that about 50% of kids who have Down syndrome will have a heart defect. But in the 1980s, nobody was going to do a repair for a child with Down syndrome who had a heart defect. In the 90s, you started to get more integration into schools and started to recognize really the importance of early interventions. And now we're getting to that time when high schools are starting to have to figure out what to do with, teenagers who have Down syndrome, and families are now thinking about what's that next step even look like. So parents often come in with whatever their conception is from whatever their experience was, whether they went to high school with somebody with Down syndrome, thinking about the age that they are now, or if they're somebody in their community who has Down syndrome. And that person, again, is going to be a little bit on the older side. And often say that, the outcomes are going to be very different because we've gotten better about what we can do for kids and adults who have Down syndrome medically, but also I think society's gotten a lot better. Programs like what DeSaco has been able to do in Central Ohio with extending, how kids learn with Down syndrome is really important, and catering to what they need to be the best version of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. When you say that outcomes were quite a bit different a few generations ago compared to today, that really tells us that the environment that a child who's impacted by Down syndrome lives in, grows in, develops in is going to be really important. And one of the important things as we do support these kids is to give them goals and to push boundaries. Kari, why is that important, and how can families best do that?
Yeah, a lot of times we talk about expect, not accept. And what I mean by that is It's not that you're not going to accept your loved one for who they are. That's certainly not what we're saying. You absolutely should accept your loved one as they are, but you should expect more. You should expect a life that's full of opportunities. And so we really want to highlight that when we're talking with families of dream big. You can get there if you're going to have to put in more work. I mean, that is a piece. And that's really where organizations like ours wrap around the entire family to help elevate them to where they need to go. And that is addressing the other needs that a family has, whether that's connectivity, financial resources, educational resources. You really do need to be there to support the whole family to get there. But people can achieve great things. This goes for anybody, but people with Down syndrome, especially if supported in the right ways, they can really blossom and thrive. I have a brother with Down syndrome. I'm sure I've disclosed that on a previous episode, but full disclosure, I do have a 39-year-old bro who is living his best life. And I can say confidently that from a very, very early age, my parents were rallying around him and seeing what was available, harnessing those resources and leveraging them so that Alex could become his most independent and beautiful self that he is today.
Yeah. And really, it takes kind of a village, really, to surround. I'm sure your brother had a lot of support, from your family, of course, but I imagine throughout the community as well. And I think you said he lives independently, yes?
Yeah. He has someone come a couple days a week to take him to run errands and, keep his haircut fresh and that beard trimmed and all that type of stuff. But generally, he takes a ride to and from work on his own and goes out and does things in the community, which is something that I can't say that growing up, I don't know what my parents expected. I can vividly recall watching Life Goes On in the 90s and seeing Chris Burke, who really changed the trajectory, I think, of that shift of expect, especially at that time, as Dr. Manickam said, that was very uncommon to see an actor with Down syndrome. Luckily, people like Chris Burke have paved that way. And oftentimes, I think some families are like, yeah, not everybody, though, is this celebrity. No, they're not. And we've done a podcast, which in the past has not garnered near the listens that yours has, but just about really just the ordinary lives, meaning that they're just living like everybody else. And so you don't hear about that as much. You do hear about the celebrities and actors and somebody who's run 5 marathons, but there are plenty of people that are living their lives to their fullest potential, which are extremely independent lives.
And then I do want to point out that while goals and pushing boundaries is really important, those boundaries and those goals are going to be quite different from one person to another, depending on the way in which their genetic condition is expressed. And so you also shouldn't feel like you're a failure as a parent or a support group if you never get to the point where someone could live independently.
That's a great point, and I'm sure other people want to talk here too, but I do want to say we also focus on expecting great things, and we're going to help you dig in if that's where you can go and where you want to go. But we also talk about being enough, and that is a fine line to walk, especially when you don't know. You don't know. There's no playbook. Every person is unique and different. Every person with Down syndrome is different and unique, just like everybody else. And so I think that can be a bit daunting of you don't want to go later in life and think, should I have pushed more here? Should I have done more there? But you do need to accept that you're just a person who has limitations on your time and energy and your mental health. And you have a family and you've got all of these things and you are enough just caring and trying to whatever extent that you're able.
Yeah. Really, really important points. We are going to have a lot of links in the show notes for folks, including 700 Children's blog post that Dr. Manickam wrote, Down Syndrome Awareness, Dispel the Misconceptions. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But there's also a link that I really want folks to check out from the Canadian Down Syndrome Society. And they have what they call a Down Syndrome Q&A. And it's just a series of common questions that pertain to common misconceptions about Down syndrome. And there's so many of them that we just had to choose a few to include in this episode. I really like the ones we included, but if you check out the website, there's many, many more. And so these are basically just some statements of questions of what Down syndrome folks can do and maybe have difficulties with, and we may have, again, our own misconceptions about what is possible and what's not. So the first one that we have is, can a person with Down syndrome learn to read? Mark?
Absolutely. And I really appreciate what the video said on this front. The response was, of course they do. Many people with Down syndrome, whether adult or child, can learn to read just like anyone as they are entering school. People with Down syndrome may have developmental differences as well as learning style differences. So it is important for us to identify the best ways of teaching each person. And there are different resources for teachers and schools to empower them to provide the best possible educational opportunities for children and adults with Down syndrome as well as their peers.
I would take it a step further that adults with Down syndrome can also learn to read, just as Dr. M referenced, how much has changed since he started out in the field. Similarly, the science of reading has evolved significantly, which in Ohio is a really big deal. And our governor widely supports the science of reading, which is something that benefits diverse learners. And there are many adults with Down syndrome who did not receive the type of education that would benefit them in terms of literacy. And we are now seeing that. So one of the things that our organization is focusing on is adult literacy for people with Down syndrome and other developmental disabilities. And there isn't a lot of research out there right now on adults with IDD learning to read, but we have seen great results so far with our program, and we're very excited about it. So I definitely think that, for those listening who have children, absolutely, of course, yes, as Dr. Wells indicated. But I also am excited at the emerging data that we're pulling together that shows that even later in life, the old phrase, old dog, new tricks, with focused attention with literacy tutors, it's also possible then. And it's not too late.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
I would also say, it's a little bit how even education in general has gone, that it's functional. It's what you need to get by. We've heard stories before where somebody who's learning to read who has Down syndrome wants to just be able to read a menu. That doesn't seem like a big deal, but that is a really big deal for them. They want to be able to order off the menu and not just have somebody tell them, oh, these are your options, or get the same thing all the time, right? Because that's what they know how to order. But something as simple as that, it makes a big, big deal as to your own self-confidence, your own ability to be independent, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Another thing that really helps with independence is being able to get from point A to point B in a relatively quick manner. And so what about transportation in terms of riding a bike or even driving a car, Kari?
So riding a bike absolutely can be done. I'd say that's probably an easier lift for across the board, right? Because taking a driving test and practicing, getting hours in and all that stuff, that's daunting for a lot of people. I have a cousin who I hope's not listening, but she didn't get her license until she was 30. She had her law degree, but not her driver's license. So I say that to say that, not to knock my cousin, but it's a very time consuming and big process. So when you look at something like riding a bike, our organization's offered bike camp. There's I Can Shine, which is a great organization who partners with a lot of Down syndrome associations across the country to teach people to ride their own two-wheeled bikes, which is fantastic. And we've seen great success in offering that program for over 15 years in getting someone up on a bike and then on their own two-wheeled bikes. And that's just a great way, obviously, for health, but also for the social components and just the health, the mental health components of being able to be navigating your community with your peers and going out and things of that nature. There are people with Down syndrome that can attain their driver's license. I always joke that I do not ever want to see my brother behind the wheel because I've seen him behind the wheel of a golf cart, and that's, enough. But I joke as a sibling because that's what siblings do. But I think for him, that would be more difficult. But there are certainly people who can and do. So I would say that probably more often there are people that can, that maybe don't, because they access other resources, or they've just they just have financial constraints from making that commitment. But it doesn't mean it's not possible.
And again, going back to that functional part, we live now in a society that has Uber and has Lyft. It has means of helping people travel from point A to point B. So maybe that's less of an issue and a limitation than it used to be. And we also live in Columbus, which doesn't have great infrastructure. But in cities that do have buses and trains and things and subways, it can be a lot easier to travel by those than it is to drive. So again, you have to kind of adjust to the world that you have to live in.
Yeah.
And that is one of the cool things in Ohio. The Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities recently made changes to their waiver funding so that Alex can use Lyft to get to work and to other places, and the waiver will cover up to a certain amount of that expense, which affords him a lot more flexibility with how he lives his life. If he can take an Uber to get to a WWE event on his own, and maybe that means I don't have to go, what a beautiful gift,
Yes. Well, now, in addition to WWE events, people also go to jobs and use transportation to go to work.
Right.
Yes. Murugu, what is the outlook for jobs for folks with Down syndrome?
Yeah, so again, this is one of those that they're just now starting to really push the boundaries on, I think. Again, the way education works is sometimes we educate to get people into college or to get advanced beyond that. But now kind of thinking more about vocational training and starting that training early means that if you can get somebody into the habit of doing certain things, then they can be very productive at that. There is going to be intellectual disability with Down syndrome. We shouldn't sugarcoat that. So there are going to be some limitations, but we have to find the right job for the right person, right? And so I think that is what we're really starting to try to focus on. I will mention too, a big part of this is communication and communication skills. Kids who and adults who have Down syndrome have this reputation for being, very they're very quote unquote happy, and they are very sociable and personable, and that somewhat is true, but it is also a stereotype, right? And that doesn't necessarily translate into them being able to communicate well with everybody. And so sometimes you do have to really work on that. There's another group here in Central Ohio called Buddy Up for Life that really has worked really hard at helping with these communication skills, because that is the key to getting a job and holding a job and being able to do some of these things by being able to communicate well.
Improv is another great way too. And the Improvineers, they've done a lot. They're based out of Akron area, and they also work across Ohio and also in other states as well. And improv is a great way to focus on those listening skills and then replying back based on what you heard, which is a really fun way to learn how to, be a better communicator. And so there are lots of different ways, but communication, Dr. M is right, is such a big part of employability.
And I would imagine that it's going to be important for employers to treat folks with Down syndrome fairly, and maybe there needs to be support and someone making sure that they're not being taken advantage of, because we want, fair pay, good working conditions. And I have seen some articles that would say that businesses tend to thrive when people with disabilities are employed, including those with Down syndrome. There does need to be someone who's advocating for them and making sure that they aren't being taken advantage of. Would you agree with that?
I definitely think that happens. I can say, though, that Alex being in a community setting, and we see this a lot for even on our team, we have someone with Down syndrome here. It's Stephanie's coworkers, it's Alex's coworkers that are the ones, that's the beauty of inclusion, is somebody that is around them is seeing things and saying things. And so that's really one of the reasons that, separate classrooms that we're thankfully moving away from, we're actually more unsafe than safe, despite what parents, I think, believe. And that's because you really don't have those checks and balances. And same with community settings and community employment. I think there are some perceptions that out in the community means more vulnerable, but in many ways that gives more opportunity for people who are caring and love your loved one to step in and say something when they see something not right, whether that's from a customer or another coworker or whatever. And so I see that that's really where that inclusion is so important.
Yeah,
So I'll
absolutely.
point out Carrie's told this story before, but like her brother's neighbors look out for him. They are constantly like making sure that he's okay. And even when somebody shows up at the door that they don't recognize, they're kind of making sure that he's getting protected, right? Like he's just part of their community.
Yeah, and I'm sure that, Carrie, that probably gives you a lot of peace of mind knowing that the people who surround Alex care about him.
Oh, yeah. I mean, luckily it was dark. I was bawling uncontrollably. I was so happy that, the story that Dr. M's thinking about, I was locked out of Alex's house and trying to get in, and I'm his landlord, full disclosure. So I was trying to get in, and I don't know if he was home or not answering or whatever. So I'm messing with the door, and it's dusk. And a lady comes out across the street and is like, "Hey, can I help you?" And I'm mumbling, and I'm like kind of pissed because I can't get into the house. And I said, finally, she wasn't going anywhere. She was coming at me, not at me, but, across the street. And I said, "Sorry, I'm Alex's sister. I'm just trying to get into his house." And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were." And I said, "No, thanks for looking out. I appreciate it." And she said, "Of course, that's what we do." And then she pointed around all the other houses and said, "That's what we all do." And, that why I cried is because that's all I've ever wanted for Alex. The neighbors love him more than they love me. They're yelling at me, they don't even know I'm a neighbor. But they're all looking out for Alex's house because they want to make sure that he's not getting taken advantage of. And I'd be lying if I said when he first didn't head out that way, I thought, oh my gosh, he has Down syndrome. It's all over his face. He's going to be targeted, and it's been quite the opposite. I mean, the whole community does consider themselves an ally to Alex and a support to Alex and someone to keep their eyes peeled for Alex.
Yeah.
And make sure that he's safe.
Absolutely. Has Alex had any relationships? So any girlfriends, any romantic interests? And do folks with Down syndrome ever get married?
So I'm an overbearing sister. So this is important to note for the record, for the millions of listeners. He has recently developed his first serious relationship, and I'm trying to be cool about it, but I'm not cool at all. I'm really, really pumped. And last week was Alex's birthday, and he went out to dinner with this wonderful woman. And so I am so excited about it. I've recently binge watched Love on the Spectrum, which includes people with autism and Down syndrome and other developmental disabilities. And I would highly recommend that. I don't know if you want to plug it as a resource, but it's a very eye-opening take on what people with Down syndrome, autism, and other developmental disabilities, really what they want out of relationships. And we're not just talking friends. They want to explore their sexuality. They want to get married. Some want kids. Some don't want kids. I mean, it's quite the range. Some don't ever want to be married. They just want a long-time partner to do life with. And so Alex is blossoming at the young age of 39, which I didn't expect to see, but he was holding out for the Bella twins, the WWE divas. So I really didn't think that it was, anything was going to happen here. And I say that jokingly, but I really partially wasn't sure if that's what he wanted. And so I'm still not sure where it will go with Paige, but I do know that FaceTiming her and talking to her every day is now part of the fabric of his daily life. And it's really exciting to see that for him. And I would want that for any of my loved ones, any my sister too. I want that's, for them to have a special someone. So it's exciting. And we do see people get married, and have longtime significant others and some that date everybody and, everything just like you would see for anybody else.
Yeah, that's really terrific. And when we compare that to past generations, we're talking about folks learning to read, riding bikes, possibly getting a driver's license, having a job, living independently with help and support, and then even having relationships and possibly getting married. That was really not the experience of those impacted by Down syndrome just even maybe 1 or 2 generations ago, right? Right, Dr. Manickam?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can even think, like the parents are being protective of them. They were looking out for what they thought were their best interests. And you can understand that also from the perspective of they don't want them to get heartbroken. They're just protecting them like any parent would want to protect their child. But usually the course would be that you kind of go through those teenage years and you start to realize they're going to be their own person. But we do often see, that you go through your teen years when you have Down syndrome, sometimes in your 20s and maybe even a little bit beyond that. And so you have to kind of adjust a little bit. And parents are now starting to get around to that idea that, I have to stop overly being overbearing on them. I have to stop hovering over them and let them be them. And it's also part of just natural progression that they will want to do that at some point. They're going to want to be teenagers. They're going to want to talk back to you. They're going to want independence. And for parents before, it was something like, no, I've got to do what's best for them, period. Yeah. But now there's coming around on, no, I've got to let them be the best version of themselves.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
Sorry. And across Ohio, but even beyond, there's really a new heightened push around supported decision-making, which is something that also is evolving. I think historically, parents are told, whether that's in medical offices or in classrooms or wherever they may be, when they turn 18, you need to go for guardianship. And that's a big piece that we're now really pushing that, and we're pushing that mentality, which is hard for families. And I say that, again, I am an overbearing sister that's always looking out for Alex, but I can have power of attorney over financial and medical things to be there as a resource to him without being his guardian. So Alex does not have a guardian. He is his own guardian, so to speak. And I think that's really where we're headed. So Dr. Mike, you're kind of talking about where we've been and where we are today. But I think talking about where we're headed is this concept of supported decision-making and really encouraging not immediately going for guardianship for your loved one. And sometimes that's a little risky because, as Dr. M indicated, some of those teenage years express themselves a little bit later, past the age of 18. And so there are many people with typical 18-year-olds that are like, I wish that I could still be guardian, but that's really where I think there's a lot of opportunity on the road ahead to continue to push a self-directed life. Alex is choosing his own life and makes decisions that I don't always agree with, but that's his right to choose that. And I think that's really hard for families. I know it's hard for me, and I'm not even his parent. I'm just a sibling. And so that's where I see us heading. And there's a lot. It's important that we're talking about that, because when we're talking about loving somebody, it also means allowing them to be themselves and choosing what they want for their life within reason, of course.
Yeah.
And I think going along the same lines, I'll push from this other side, though, from the medical side, we have this fairly arbitrary number of age 18 that you become an adult, right? That you get to make your own choices. And sometimes it is actually that they might be chronologically 18, but they're not quite at the maturity of an 18-year-old. I'm using quotes to say that. And so sometimes the guardianship is necessary at that point, but not when they're 26 or something like that. But again, I think as Kari is kind of saying, it is a little bit of a moving target, and we do need to find the right balance, and it's not going to be the same for everyone.
Yeah, I would say, though, it's really hard. We know this from, and I'm not poking fun, but we know from Britney Spears, it's very difficult to get guardianship overturned. So that's really where we're pushing this concept of maybe scaffolding, what is needed. What do you need to start with? So power of attorney is much easier to add in and remove than guardianship. And so I definitely agree and think there are certainly situations where it's fairly cut and dry. I would say within the Down syndrome community, though, there's a range, and you can get guardianship pretty easily and pretty quickly, especially if there's an emergency. It's almost impossible to overturn it, which is why we've made this push towards the supported decision making as a first step.
One thing that kind of comes into my mind as you're talking about all of this is that it's so dependent upon the environment that a child grows up in, kind of where the outcome is. And so that does set up the possibility of disparity, both in terms of health, social, being able to live independently, all of those things. Mark, are there some ways that we can assure health equity and social equity for people not only with Down syndrome, but really with disabilities in general?
So I wish that I could say that there was, the way, like a magic one by which I could assure health equity for people with disabilities. But I want to sort of address different ways by which we can get to those paths. And when I talk about health equity, I want to discuss fair access and opportunity for people to achieve their health-related goals, for them to reach their fullest potential. So first of all, I would want to ensure we're listening to people with respect to what those goals are. And that way we can adequately determine what the goals are, and then in discussion with them, determine what barriers do exist. I don't want to come into a situation in which I'm assuming what the goals are and what those barriers to health are. And then from those discussions, taking time to take action in whatever role that I can in my role in healthcare, whether that's ensuring adequate access to well-equipped exam rooms to ensure we can do adequate measurements well, whether we're ensuring adequate access to assistive devices to assist with motor function or communication, or even by means of ensuring adequate means of transportation to and from appointments. I recognize that there's a lot of different ways by which we can address health equity for people with disabilities, but I think that the biggest thing is just inviting conversation with everyone who would be invested in their care, whether that's people themselves, their families, the community surrounding them. That way we can invite everyone who's invested into the conversation.
Yeah. Kari, do you have any additional thoughts on some of the specific barriers, like with Alex, that you've come across in terms of health and social needs?
Well, I think generally equity with healthcare is obviously a huge problem, again, across the country, disability or not. But from the onset, we are seeing some disparities just even at, the time of diagnosis and the timeliness of diagnosis, which is something that I think since we've last been on here with you has been published. And so that can change a lot of things. I mean, if, for example, someone like Dr. M isn't bedside talking about, with we know to be best practices and delivering a diagnosis and offering supports and being there. And if that's not happening and you're finding out from a call a week later, once you're home, that's a completely different way to start out your journey. And then it evolves from there. And so when you look at that just from the onset, when you look at language barriers and just the networking that exists among the typical population, hey, did you know that you do need to get tested for sleep apnea? And maybe a doctor told you, but now you've got a girlfriend or, the dad's groups hanging out talking about how much sleep studies stink. And you're like, oh, wait, I guess I should probably do that. But if you've got these disparities that extend beyond just what's happening inside of a doctor's office, then that just compounds. And so one of the things that we're doing at the Down Syndrome Association is making sure that we're bridging connections for Latino and Hispanic families and Black and African American families and Somali families where, in some of these communities, culturally, there's a lot more to navigate than what you might typically see in a central household or beyond. And so I think it's a multi-pronged approach to look at this, just like it is with healthcare for anybody. You can equip just physicians or you can equip families, but you need to hear it more than once, and you need to have someone else tell you why it's important. Because most people might think, why does my 3-year-old need a sleep study? That sounds ridiculous. I mean, my grandpa just got one for the first time and he's 70 and snores until he wakes himself up. And I'm not seeing that. So, you have all these different reasons that there are just barriers to access, not even talking about insurance and transportation and some of those basic things that you would see.
Yeah. And that's where an organization like the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio is going to be so important to help families maybe anticipate obstacles and barriers and with the experience on how exactly to overcome those.
Yeah, we have someone on our team that's there to help with that. And we also have a contract with an external company that helps our families navigate access to healthcare. And if they can't access it with their existing coverage, they're helping on a family's behalf find financial resources to access those services. It's a complicated system to navigate for anybody. And when you're overwhelmed with so many other things, OT, PT, speech, you got all these different appointments all the time. The last thing you want to do is stay up late at night hoping you can catch someone at 8:45 p.m. to talk to them about your insurance coverage. So that's a thing too.
Yeah, and I think it has to be very intentional. I think DeSaco and even Nationwide Children's has been very intentional about addressing these disparities. I was going to even bring up, another example in the area of disabilities, ableism, is this idea that we really have to give people the environment to shine. We have to give people the ability to get what they need out of the system. And that really is becoming a bigger mantra as part of this breaking the stereotypes that don't put limitations on people, because people are going to reach it and then you're going to think, oh, that's great. But really you want to create a system where they're the best version of themselves.
Yeah, definitely. Mark, there is this thing called the Lots of Socks campaign that is associated with World Down Syndrome Day this year. What is the Lots of Socks campaign? And we'll put a link to it in the show notes.
So the Lots of Socks campaign is a campaign geared toward raising awareness of Down syndrome through use of colorful or mismatched socks. So it's meant to be happening on March 21st, so World Down Syndrome Day, to make people ask, so why are you wearing those socks? And it gives you an opportunity then to talk and invite conversations like, well, I wanted to raise awareness in this respect, and here's what I would like you to know about, what your thoughts about, a person who has Down syndrome is and how you can then overcome stereotypes regarding them. I'm very excited because I get to wear some Sesame Street socks I have that are mismatched that involve Oscar the Grouch and Elmo.
Yeah, that is fantastic. And if you don't know a lot about Down syndrome yourself, if you wear mismatched and colorful and funny socks that get, someone to say, "Hey, why are you wearing those socks?" At the very least, you could give them the link to this podcast so that they can learn more about Down syndrome, or the last one that we did, or any of the many wonderful resources that we're going to have in the show notes. So you don't have to be a Down syndrome expert to wear fun socks and raise awareness and improve everyone's health literacy.
Absolutely.
All right. So this is our parent podcast, but we also have a lot of pediatric providers who listen. And so I just wanted to leave pediatricians and family practice docs and nurse practitioners and such some resources to be able to help them provide great medical care for their kids and teenagers with Down syndrome. Murugu, what are some best practices for providing that care, and what resources can primary care providers rely on?
Yeah, so we're really fortunate. The American Association of Pediatrics has had guidelines for the care of kids with Down syndrome for the last 20 years. I think they're coming up on their third or fourth version right now, and it's updated every couple of years. And those are really the best practices. These are evidence-based practices, and what I really always liked about them is that they're broken down by age. This is what we should do from birth to 1 month, and then 1 month to 1 year, and 1 year to 4, and so forth. And it really does give a little bit of a roadmap that families and primary care providers can have for what the general medical care is. But I think it's also really important to be part of your community, that the community often will tell you and help you along the way too. And then more recently, they've come out with adult guidelines as well. And again, best evidence is a little bit harder to come in that, because we're just starting to kind of recognize where the gaps were in care. And so the evidence is coming along, but it's coming along slow. And that is an ongoing process as well to update those. But the first set came out in 2019, I think, just before the pandemic, something like that. Or Kari, if you can correct me there on timing. I don't remember now. off the
I
top of my
think
head.
it was late 2020.
Was it 2020? Okay.
So we have the American Academy of Pediatrics Health Supervision for Children and Adolescents with Down Syndrome. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Nationwide Children's also has some great age-specific guidelines with Down syndrome practice tools. So you can look at your patient's age, and it'll give you some ideas of the things that you ought to be doing in terms of providing primary care. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And then we also did another podcast. It was one of our CME podcasts that is good for Category 1 CME and a CE for nurses as well, education. And that is on care and support for children with Down syndrome. That was, again, PediaCast CME episode 86, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Now, in addition to taking care of these kids from a health standpoint, we also want to think about the social aspect. And Kari, what sort of resources are available to help both providers and families really socially support kids and teenagers who are impacted by Down syndrome? Where can they go for help?
Well, every state is unique in what they offer as a system for the developmental disability community. So that's tricky to navigate. In Ohio, we have case managers, service and support administrators. They've got a lot of different names that can sometimes be a resource for what is available in your community. Of course, I'm somewhat biased, but I would say if you've got a local Down syndrome association in your community, I would start there. I know with our team, we say we are a concierge. So you come to us and tell us what you're looking for, and we're going to help guide you to that specific thing based on where you live and what you need. And so I think that that's something that you could expect from other Down syndrome associations around the country. If you want a full listing of what those are, you can go to the National Down Syndrome Society website. You can also go to the Global Down Syndrome Foundation website, and they'll list. But you could also just look up, Down Syndrome Association in my area to see what's available to you. That's certainly a way to connect and as a starting point for what might be available to you.
So there may be lots of great resources online, but there's nothing that really takes the place of having a support group locally that knows the local resources and can, you can meet over coffee with someone, just to talk about things. And now that the pandemic is over, that in-person connection in terms of advocacy and helping connect with the community is just super important.
Yeah, we've made really doubled down in investments in what we call outreach events, and also have expanded our monthly groups that meet, whether that's moms groups, dads groups, teen group, adult, whatever, all different age ranges and all over our service area, which we serve 23 counties. But, we just hosted an event out in Zanesville, which for those of you, it's like an hour and a half away, and we had 70 people. And so there really is that hunger for connectivity. And then they're meeting people that they can connect with when we're not there, that they maybe didn't know otherwise, whether that's a more of a mentorship type of relationship or a peer relationship. And both are welcome depending on where the person is in their life. So we definitely offer lots of virtual resources. There is the Down Syndrome Diagnosis Network, DSDN, that connects people and families who have loved ones with Down syndrome through Facebook. But usually that's an and, not an or. Like, it's not to replace that in-person connection. And so we see, as you guys are probably well aware, people come from all over to access the incredible services that and medical expertise that the Nationwide Children's Hospital has to offer. Similarly, families will travel to connect in meaningful ways with other families because there's that community is what drives you all the other days that when you're feeling alone and you feel like you're facing something in your school district or someone made fun of your child, or there are just so many highs and lows. And to do that alone can really take a toll on not only the parents, but the entire family. And so we do as much as we can to offer those types of options and ways to connect in the community.
Yeah. And we'll put links in the show notes to the National Down Syndrome Society and the Down Syndrome Congress, which has resources on both of those sites to help people sort of navigate what may be available locally for them.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And if, in Ohio, we have a nifty license plate, and downsyndromeohio.org will guide you on a map of like where you live. And some states have adopted similar things. Kentucky, I know, has, and there's rumors of California. I'm not sure if they did, but having a state map. So depending on where you live, you found where your home was, because there are geographic limitations, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, Mark, tell us more about the care of patients with Down syndrome locally here in Central Ohio at Nationwide Children's Hospital.
Absolutely. So at the Down Syndrome Clinic at Nationwide Children's Hospital, we do care for children and young adults who have Down syndrome. We try to provide comprehensive care looking at the medical, behavioral, and developmental aspects of care. So in coming to our clinic, you may see a medical provider as well as a psychologist. In other encounters, you may see a medical provider as well as an occupational therapist, a speech therapist, a physical therapist. So we're looking toward paths of integrating care for children with Down syndrome in many different respects. So our goal is to continue to integrate care based upon the AP guidelines and also listening to the needs of families in the community to ensure sufficient care coordination from a medical perspective, so we can become a good home within the community for children and young adults with Down syndrome.
And then again, we'll have lots of resources in the show notes for folks. One of the primary resources that I would like to direct families that are here in Central Ohio to is the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio. And again, we'll put a link to that in the show notes for you over at PediaCast.org. Kari, how can families connect with and support the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio?
Well, we have about 1 million ways we will find you. If you want to be connected to us, we don't hunt anyone down, I promise. We only want, if you want to be connected to us, we are there for you. But of course, on social media, we're really proud of a resource that we've recently put out for new families on Instagram. It's called Expecting Extraordinary, which is a great way to hear some of the storytelling and the raw feelings that a new parent has upon receiving a Down syndrome diagnosis. We're, of course, on Instagram and Facebook with the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio. We've got a website, dsaco.net. And we're also really connected and really grateful for the connections that we have with both Nationwide Children's Hospital's Down Syndrome Clinic, as well as the Ohio State University's Nysonger Center's Adult Clinic. And we're really grateful for all of the ways that they partner with us and they allow us to be an extension of that resource to the community. And so we also get referrals that way as well. But you can just go online and submit an application, and it doesn't take much, and we don't charge you, and we will be there as little or as much as you'd like. But I tend to think of it like kind of how a lot of families go through school. It's like you kind of get to choose how involved you are. You can become a part of the PTA and you can be all in, or you can just kind of come to the things as you feel like you can with your time and your energy. But when things go wrong at the school, we're there to help you and help figure out how to be a resource. So in that instance, I guess we're not the school. We're not the school causing the problems, but we are there to help pick up the pieces along the way. And there are always things, we have families call us sometimes saying, my kid got kicked out of swim class. And what do I do? And it's usually that type of stuff. Of course, we offer programs and, educational things and potty training workshops and all kinds of stuff. But it's also being there when the unexpected pops up. And that's what we've heard is such a huge value, because you never really know when that stuff's going to happen. But when it does, you want to know you've got someone that's going to be there for you in your corner and really helping to pick you up and lift you up.
Yeah.
So.
And maybe it's someone who has been through that themselves. There's someone else out there whose kid also got kicked out of swim team and club, and they can at least tell you their experience and maybe what they did, what worked, what didn't work, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're talking a lot about the challenges, but even just my 11-year-old's finally potty trained, there's nothing sweeter than celebrating it with people who really get it. And I'm not knocking, friends of typical children, but they just cannot understand the visceral elation that you've got when this thing that's been weighing on you for so long is finally no longer a barrier. And so it's not just kind of going through the tough, it's also having that community that's really there to celebrate with you in a way that they get it. And there's something inherently valuable in that.
Yeah, definitely. So once again, we are going to have a ton of resources in the show notes for folks. So be sure to head over to PediaCast.org and look for the show notes for this episode 558. Everything from the Down Syndrome Clinic at Nationwide Children's, of course, the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio, the World Down Syndrome Day. We have practice tools, the Health Supervision Guide from the American Academy of Pediatrics, that Canadian Down Syndrome Society site with the Q&As that we talked about earlier, lots of socks campaign. So lots, and those two PediaCast episodes we talked about too. One for parents that really takes a deep dive on Down syndrome itself. And then also the one that's for providers and worth Category 1 CME credit if you listen. And that credit is still active, so folks can check that out. Again, all of those links in the show notes over at PediaCast.org. So once again, Dr. Mark Wells and Dr. Murugu Manickam, both with Nationwide Children's Hospital, and Kari Jones, President and CEO of Elevated and the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you again so much for having us.
Thank you. This has been awesome.
We are back with just enough time to say thanks once again to all of you for taking time out of your day and making PediaCast a part of it. Really do appreciate that. Also, thanks once again to our guests this week, Dr. Mark Wells and Dr. Murugu Manickam with Nationwide Children's Hospital, and Kari Jones with Elevated and the Down Syndrome Association of Central Ohio. Don't forget, you can find PediaCast wherever podcasts are found. We're in the Apple and Google podcast apps, iHeartRadio, Spotify, SoundCloud, Amazon Music, YouTube, and most other podcast apps for iOS and Android. Our landing site is PediaCast.org. You'll find our entire archive of past programs there, along with show notes for each of the episodes, our terms of use agreement, and that handy contact page if you would like to suggest a future topic for the program. Reviews are helpful wherever you get your podcasts. We always appreciate when you share your thoughts about the show, and we love connecting with you on social media. You'll find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, Twitter, X. Simply search for PediaCast. Also, don't forget about our sibling podcast, PediaCast CME. It is similar to this program. We turn up the science a couple notches and offer free continuing medical education credit for those who listen. And that includes doctors, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, nurses, pharmacists, psychologists, social workers, and dentists. And since Nationwide Children's is jointly accredited by all of those professional organizations, it's likely we offer the exact credits you need to fulfill your state's continuing medical education requirements. Of course, you want to be sure the content of the episode matches your scope of practice. Shows and details are available at the landing site for that program, PediaCastCME.org. You can also listen wherever podcasts are found. Simply search for PediaCast CME. Thanks again for stopping by, and until next time, this is Dr. Mike saying stay safe, stay healthy, and stay involved with your kids. So long, everybody.
This program is a production of Nationwide Children's. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on PediaCast.